Okay, guys, I'm ready to start the second video for, well, I guess it's the third since I had to make two for sensations, but I'm going to make the last video for unit number 5. This will be on the endocrine system. So we're transitioning from finally the nervous system, where we spent several class periods or lectures, I guess, going through it, and now we're on to a new system. Now, the nervous system and the endocrine system are very, very important. In fact, those are the two main systems that coordinate the function of all body systems. So basically what that means is they're in charge. Okay, they coordinate all the activities of any and all systems, skeletal system that we've talked about, muscular system that we've talked about, and then systems that we haven't talked about, like digestive, urinary, reproductive, etc. Okay, I want to talk first of all about just what makes up the endocrine system, what we call glands. Okay, glands that regulate body activities. Now, thinking back to the very beginning of the semester when we were still actually getting to meet together, we learned that there were two types of glands. This was back in our tissues lecture. We learned that there were exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Okay, we talked about exocrine glands quite a bit in detail when we talked about the skin, things like your sweat glands, your oil glands, your wax glands, even mammary glands, and a lactating female are all examples of exocrine glands. Key with those is that they contain a duct, which is like a tube that carries the secretion from the cells out of the glands and then either into the lumen of a body cavity, like, if you think like inside of your stomach where we release digestive enzymes, or to the surface of our skin, and like, from the sweat and oil that we produce and release our skin surface. I'm not going to be talking about those here. Okay. What we're going to be talking about, obviously, since it's the endocrine system, are endocrine glands. Okay, key features of them: they have no ducts, so they're ductless. The products they secrete are called hormones, and those products are, instead of being released into a duct, are just released out of the cell and into the interstitial space, where the interstitial fluid collects it, and then that is going to allow for the fluid and the interstitial fluid, the water, and the hormones to be brought into the cell, or into the blood, where they're then going to be transported throughout the bloodstream to target cells throughout the body. Okay. There are two major types of endocrine glands: those that are wholly endocrine in function, meaning that their only job is to produce hormones, and that includes both parts of the pituitary gland, the singular thyroid, the 4 parathyroids, 2 or pair of adrenals, and then 1 pineal. Now, we've talked about some of these a little bit before. If you think back to when we talked about the brain, we learned about the pineal gland. We talked a little bit about the pituitary. And these others, like the thyroid, parathyroids, adrenals, pretty much brand new to us, but that's okay. Okay. Then you've got a whole host of other organs that have glandular cells, so they secrete hormones, but they have more of a prominent role in something else. Okay. For example, hypothalamus, up in our brain, its primary role is nervous system functions. Okay, but it does produce hormones. Okay, thymus, it's a hormone-producing organ, but its main role is for immunity. Okay, pancreas, ovaries, testes, kidneys, stomach, liver, small intestine, skin, heart, adipose tissue, and the placenta are examples of those that are, we kind of call them secondary endocrine organs. Okay, we're not going to go through each of those. We will talk about some of them, but things like the stomach, the liver, the small intestine, skin, we just really don't talk about them too much in this class. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, the nervous and the endocrine systems are kind of in charge of everything, and I shouldn't even say kind of, they are in charge of everything. So we can kind of take them as individual units and put them together and call it the neuroendocrine system, and it describes the cooperation of those two systems to perform general functions of things like communication, integration, and control. Okay. Very prominent functions of our body. Our endocrine system is composed of secreting cells that send hormone molecules via the bloodstream to specific target cells contained in target tissues or target organs. Okay. So we're going to be talking a lot about hormones, they are defined as mediator molecules released in one part of the body, but regulating activity of cells in other parts of the body. And for example, we release a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone up in our brain, then travels by way of the bloodstream down to the thyroid, where it then tells the thyroid what to do. Okay. In order for the thyroid to respond to that thyroid stimulating hormone, it is a target organ that has target cells with specific receptors. These are proteins that are found on the surface of the cell, and they go together perfectly, and only the thyroid is going to have receptors for that hormone, and that's how we are able to target specific organs. And in our body, we produce 50 plus hormones, and they only affect a few cells, even though those hormones may reach all of the cells of the body, or many of the cells of the body, and by way of our bloodstream. As I talked about, those receptors are very specific, either proteins or glycoproteins on the plasma membrane of those target cells. And then it's the shape or geometry of the molecules, both the receptors and the hormones. So you can kind of think of it like a lock and a key, how specific keys only fit in specific locks. You know, you can't just expect your car key to, to plug into any lock, because it doesn't have the right shape, and therefore won't, unlock your house key or house door or something like that. And down here at the bottom is an illustration of the different organs that make up the endocrine system. We've got kind of a multiple set of views here. It's just kind of a straight up anterior view with the head turned slightly to the right, or I guess to the left in that person. If we zoom in at this kind of segment of the brain, we can see some things that we've talked about before: the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the pituitary hanging down from the hypothalamus. We'll zoom in and talk about those things in much greater detail and look at their kind of more intricate features here in the next couple of slides. Down in the throat is where you can find the thyroid, which is an anterior organ. On the back side of the thyroid, and that's why we have this posterior view, are the 4 parathyroids. If you zoom in, if I zoom in, they're tiny little green dots in this picture, about the size of a pea. So what we eat as peas, not me, because peas are terrible, but that's how tiny they are. And we've got typically 4 of them right on the backside of the thyroid. Now, don't confuse the thyroid with the thymus. The thymus sits on top of the heart, kind of like a top hat. Other organs that we'll talk about would be the pancreas, which is this kind of dotted image or portion of our image, just to illustrate where it would be located. It's a very posterior organ. In fact, it's a retroperitoneal organ. So you'd have to remove all these organs just to be able to find it. The pair of adrenal glands that sit up on top of the kidneys are also pretty far back there. So they're kind of just showing you where they would be located. And this bottom area of the abdomen down in the pelvic area would be where the female reproductive organs would be located. And that's what this box over here is showing you. Uterus is not functional for the endocrine system, but the ovaries on each side of the uterus are. And then if this was a male, which it happens to be, the testes inside the scrotum are hormone-producing organs that we'll talk about as well. Other than that, we really won't talk about things like the lungs and the skin, liver, stomach, etc. Okay, let's first of all, before we dive in on those organs, talk about the ways that the nervous system and endocrine system are kind of similar and how they're different. Since we're doing a transition from the nervous system after spending 4 lectures on it, I wanted to kind of compare the 2 systems. They share several properties, but they're also very different in many ways. First of all, the way that they communicate is different. The nervous system uses both electrical and chemical means. Electrical means being action potentials, chemical means being neurotransmitters, and then the endocrine system is strictly chemical, and those chemicals are hormones. Speed and persistence of response, very, very quick, very abrupt in stopping though with the nervous system. Whereas the endocrine system, you're taking hormones and you're dumping them into the blood, and you're relying on the bloodstream to carry those hormones. So the effect can take, hours, days, maybe even weeks for that response to continue. If you want to compare the 2 systems and how they work, how quickly, think of it like sending a text message is like how the nervous system works. Whereas, you hit send, provided you got good service and all that stuff, pretty much instantaneously that message is going to be delivered. Whereas sending an old-fashioned letter through the mail system would be how like a hormone works. And that also kind of relates to what we're talking about here with long-term stimuli. Nervous system adapts really quickly, so the response declines, whereas the endocrine system, the response persists. The area of effect is very targeted and specific for the nervous system, but it's much more widespread. In fact, many organs can be acted upon by those hormones, and we can have widespread effects as a result. There's a lot of overlap and that's because some chemicals can function as both hormones and neurotransmitters, like norepinephrine, which is released by postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, and in doing so, it's considered a neurotransmitter. It's also released by chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, which makes it a hormone. It's the same chemical, it's just who's releasing it that's different. And now some neurons, what we call neuroendocrine cells, neuroendocrine neurons, actually can release hormones like oxytocin and the catecholamines. And then other things, there's overlapping effects that these two systems have on same target cells. For example, norepinephrine and glucagon cause glycogen hydrolysis in the liver, and then they regulate each other. Hormones can stimulate or inhibit neurons. Neurons can inhibit or trigger hormone secretion. And illustration down here at the bottom is just kind of comparing the two. It's not something I'm really going to get into, but you can kind of look through it on your own. Okay, now we get to finally dive in on some of the organs, beginning with a familiar friend of ours, the hypothalamus. As we learned previously, forms the floor and the walls of the third ventricle of the brain. It's a major regulator of things like your autonomic nervous system. It's your thermostat, it's your thirst and hunger center, so on and so forth. And it's also interrelated and functions in the endocrine system. We have seen it before, talked about what its makeup is. At the time we talked about the hypothalamus, when we talked about the brain, we learned that suspended from it, basically dangling down kind of like a punching bag, is the pituitary gland. Okay. Also known as the hypophysis, excuse me. It's about 1 centimeter in diameter, lies at the base of the brain in the area known as the sella turcica, which is called the Turkish saddle. Okay. That's what this kind of curved portion of the sphenoid bone is, labeled here as the hypophyseal fossa. Same thing, that's something we learned about back when we learned about the cranial bones. Okay. There's a stalk that attaches the hypothalamus, or excuse me, the pituitary to the hypothalamus. That's called the infundibulum, and that's bracketed off here on our illustration. Okay. There's two anatomically and functionally separate structures that make up the pituitary. Okay. The adenohypophysis, or anterior pituitary, which is what's typically known as, and then the neurohypophysis, which is known as the posterior pituitary. Now, even though these two structures are located together as kind of one overall pituitary gland, they couldn't be any more different. In fact, they actually develop in two different distinct portions, and the posterior pituitary actually comes down from the base of the brain, whereas the anterior pituitary comes up from like the roof of our mouth, and then they just kind of meet in the middle. And there's two major parts that make up the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary. The largest is the what we call anterior lobe, or pars dissalis, and the other part is called the pars tubralis, which forms a sheath around the infundibulum. Okay. A key feature of the anterior pituitary is its connection to the hypothalamus. Okay. What we call a hypophyseal portal system connects the two, which is a very unique connection as far as blood circulation goes. Okay. This allows blood to flow directly from the primary plexus, which is the capillary network in the hypothalamus, to the secondary plexus, another capillary network in the anterior pituitary, prior to the general circulation. If you hang tight with me, I'm going to pull up a illustration. I'm going to show you to kind of explain what that means. So I kind of drew this up here before I started recording. What we have over here on the left side of the page, kind of an illustration of how blood typically flows as far as what we would just call like general circulation. Okay. As far as hormones go, hormones are always going to be picked up by capillaries. Okay. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. This is where exchange of nutrients and waste takes place, and which means that when those hormones are picked up by the capillaries, they then flow into veins, and then the veins deliver that blood to the heart. So hormones have to be delivered to the heart before the heart pumps them out into arteries, and then eventually out to capillaries, where those hormones can leave the blood and enter in the target tissue. So what that would mean is blood always has to flow to the heart and then back out of the heart for a hormone to go from one spot to another, unless we have what's shown over here, okay, which my illustration is a little outside, but that's okay. This is an example of a portal blood connection. Okay, once again, remember, capillaries are where hormones are picked up. It's also where hormones leave the blood. Okay, so when hormones are picked up by these capillaries, instead of having to travel directly to the heart, a portal vein or portal veins, because sometimes there's two, in this case, there are going to be two, connect this capillary network to this capillary network. So there's a basically direct line to carry hormones from one structure, in this case the hypothalamus, to another structure, the anterior pituitary. And so the blood doesn't have to go to the heart and then back out to get to its ultimate destination. And I'll show you that down here in the bottom of our picture. So you see this capillary network right here, okay, what we call the primary plexus. Notice there are two connecting veins connected to this capillary network, the secondary plexus. These are the hypophysioportal veins that connect the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, which means that hormones released by the hypothalamus can get directly carried to the anterior pituitary, which is super cool. Okay. Another example of a portal blood connection we'll see here later in the semester, actually in the next unit, is what connects our like intestines and stomach to our liver. And notice there are no portal veins that connect the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And we'll talk about the connection that exists between those structures here in a minute. Okay. Now, once upon a time, and I actually remember being taught this when I was in school, they used to teach that the anterior pituitary was a master gland. Okay. They thought that the master gland being it was in control. Now we know that the hypothalamus is actually in charge of it. So hypothalamus is, the president. Anterior pituitary is like the vice president. Okay, because there are 7 hormones that are released here that control the activity of the hormones released here. Okay. Okay, let's talk about the neural hypothesis, or posterior pituitary, composed of neural tissue, meaning that it's nervous and structure, really nervous and function. Okay. 2 parts make it up. Pars nervosa, or posterior lobe, is the larger bulbar portion, and the other portion is that infundibulum that I was pointing out, that stalk that connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus. There's a third region of the pituitary called the pars intermedia, but it atrophies, so it shrinks up during the fetal development and basically just stops existing as a separate lobe in adults. Some of the cells that make it up actually do migrate into adjacent parts of the anterior pituitary where they then persist. Between both the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that includes anterior and posterior, they work together to regulate all processes having to do with things like stress, rage, your flight, like running away, like in a dangerous situation, body temperature, thirst, hunger, sexual activity, and just survival in general. And there are 16 hormones that we are at least aware of at this point that the two structure, actually, I guess I could say 3 structures secrete. Okay. Illustration here does a nice job showing you the major parts that we talked about. On the next page, I want to talk about the hormones that those pituitary parts release. I'm not going to worry about you having to know the 7 hormones that the hypothalamus releases, what we call either stimulating or inhibiting hormones. But I'm going to teach you about the hormones that the anterior pituitary releases. As far as structural makeup goes, the anterior pituitary is quite a bit larger, about 75% of the entire structure. So 75% of the pituitary, and as I said, it falls anatomically up to the floor of the mouth. Talked about the portal blood capillary system that connects it, which allows the blood-borne molecules from the hypothalamus to act upon the pituitary before they're diluted with blood and larger vessels. Hormones released by the anterior pituitary will flow into the general circulation for action on all parts of the body. They can either be those that act on non-endocrine target organs, which includes growth hormone and prolactin, or acting on other endocrine glands like thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing, and follicle stimulating hormone. All these last hormones are going to trigger action in another endocrine organ, whereas these do something completely different. And so what do those hormones do? And these are just really brief general explanations of what these hormones do. There are kind of more intricacies to it that I would talk about, like this was a physiology class, but really this is more obviously anatomy, and we're not going to get too in depth with the physiology of things, but I did want to give you a good idea of at least the major things that these hormones do. First hormone, growth hormone, exactly what it sounds like, okay? It promotes growth, okay? And it targets things like our liver, adipose tissue, soft tissue, and bones, especially soft tissues like your muscle and your bones, where it promotes growth. And it does so actually indirectly, which is something I won't get into. Another thing that it does, and this is why it targets the liver and adipose tissues, is it controls protein, lipid, and carb metabolism. So it helps with breaking down those things to make energy. And prolactin hormone that targets the mammary glands in a lactating female to stimulate milk production. Thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it sounds like. It stimulates the release of thyroid hormones from the thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, if you break down that long word, it kind of tells you exactly what's being targeted. Adreno for adrenal, cortico for cortex. Adrenal cortex is who it targets, and it tells the adrenal cortex to release some hormones. And then luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormones kind of go together. These are major regulators of the reproductive function in both men and women. So in women, it targets the ovaries, and men, it targets the testes. And I just listed promotes reproductive function. I won't get into any more detail than that. As I said, the release of these hormones is regulated by hormones from the hypothalamus. There are 7 total releasing, or really I should say, or inhibiting hormones, because they're not both. It's a releasing or an inhibiting hormone that triggers or inhibits the release of these 7 hormones that we've talked about. Okay. Posterior pituitary, anatomically derived from a downgrowth from the brain, and essentially is just an extension of the hypothalamus, illustrated in this picture that shows that there are neurons with the cell bodies back up in the hypothalamus, and the axons actually extend down and terminate in the posterior pituitary. So, like I said, it's just an extension of the hypothalamus. In fact, the posterior pituitary doesn't even secrete its own hormones. It doesn't even make them. What it does is the hormones that are released by these neurons in the hypothalamus are carried down the axons of these neurons. And so what the posterior pituitary does is it stores the hormones here and then actually releases them. So the hypothalamus is who makes the hormones, the posterior pituitary is just who releases them. Okay. So which are the hormones? Well, the first one is oxytocin, very important hormone during childbirth. It's what causes labor contractions. What that means is the uterus will push the baby out. So as a female is going through those contractions before giving birth, it's oxytocin that's making them stronger and stronger and stronger. It also helps with milk secretion after childbirth and is responsible for a female's maternal instincts. And then antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that does the opposite of what a diuretic does. If you're not familiar with what a diuretic is, it's a thing like alcohol, which college students are typically very familiar with. That makes you pee a whole bunch. And therefore, the more alcohol or more of a diuretic that you ingest, the more dehydrated you get. Okay, so that's why you wake up with a hangover on Friday or Saturday morning or Sunday morning or whatever. You're going to actually be releasing this hormone, and that's going to trigger less urine output and less sweat production to try to conserve what water you do have left in your body. And another name for this hormone is vasopressin, and that's because it is a strong blood vessel constrictor, and therefore it makes your blood pressure go up. Not something I would get into in too great detail in this class, though. Okay, moving on. Let's talk thyroid. Largest endocrine gland, has an H shape, capital H specifically, located just below the larynx, so your voice box, right below that in your throat. About 50%, sorry, I got off on the wrong line there. Consists of right and left lobe. If I zoom in our illustration here, Okay, here to me always kind of looks more like a butterfly. Would be the right lobe. Since this is an anterior view, this is their right side. So there's the right lobe. There's the left lobe. So these would be like our two vertical lines of the capital H. And then the crossbar of the H is what we call the isthmus. Okay. Here's a good illustration of, not even an illustration, a picture of a dissected thyroid. Notice in this picture, we're missing this little finger-like extension, what's called a pyramidal lobe. And that's because only about 50% of people that are 50% of thyroid, so 50% of people have that third lobe. Okay, making up the thyroid are mostly sacs of a substance inside of what we call thyroid follicle. The follicles are full of the fluid called a colloid, and it's lined by a simple cuboid epithelium of follicular cells. And that's what this picture is showing you in the bottom. Okay, here's our follicle, a sac-like structure, fluid on the inside. The cells that line it are called follicular cells. Okay, and they are what are responsible for producing the two primary hormones of the thyroid, what we call T3 and T4. Which is a really easy way to label and know them, short for triiodithyronine and tetraiodithyronine, which is something you would never ever have to know. You might also see T4 listed as thyroxine. Together, these two hormones increase your metabolic rate. What that means is they increase your metabolism or the rate of intensity of chemical reactions taking place inside of your body. There are another set of cells. You can see them what we call parafollicular or C cells, which secrete a third hormone, what we call calcitonin, which is a hormone that we release when we have high blood calcium levels, what is known as hypercalcemia. It is going to act to decrease your blood calcium levels by doing things like decreasing the osteoclasts of our body, their activity by as much as 70%. If you think back to when we talked about bones, we learned that osteoclasts, the C, have the role of breaking down bone or carving out bone to release into the blood. If our blood is already full of calcium, we don't want those guys doing that. And we want to increase the activity and number of osteoblasts, which are the bone builders that take the calcium from our blood and make strong bones. Okay. The next glands are the four parathyroids, very small, as I mentioned, about the size of a pea. Typically, we find them on the posterior surface of the thyroid. And so that's what this illustration over here on the right is showing you. What we are showing in this illustration is a posterior view. We would have to remove the cervical vertebrae to be able to see them, a lot of the neck muscles in the back as well. And you can see here the left lobe, this will be the right lobe of the thyroid, and we can see the four parathyroids. Each one has a special name, which is not really that special. Right superior, right inferior, left superior, left inferior. Simple as that. Okay. Two types of cells make up the parathyroid, principal or chief cells, which are what secrete parathyroid hormone. PTH is the most obviously named hormone of the body, in my opinion. It's called parathyroid hormone. It's released by the parathyroid glands. Simple as that. Okay, this hormone is released in response to hypocalcemia. Hypercalcemia, we learned, was high blood calcium. Hypo is low blood calcium. So these hormones, parathyroid and calcitonin, actually act against each other. They're called antagonistic hormones. This hormone, PTH, is going to increase the number and activity of those osteoclasts to elevate bone resorption, which means more bone breakdown, which means more calcium into the blood. There's also a second set of cells called oxyphil cells that make up parathyroids, but we really don't know what they do. Okay. Picture over here on the right from a cadaver showing you in the posterior view where we can see those four parathyroids. I guess they don't really show them over here as well as they do here. Maybe it's just the angle that the picture's in. And actually, there we go. We see one of those pyramidal lobes, which hits right there with our percentages. 50%, not here, but here. 1 out of 2 is 50% of thyroids have it. Okay. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the adrenals. Okay. Now, in a real world, we would color on this picture, but we're not going to do that. So I'll kind of show you in the illustration down here at the bottom what you can color on your own if you'd like. Um, but we'll get to that here in a second. Adrenal glands are absolutely essential for life, just like many of these and all of these other organs are. I don't know why I even include that sentence, but whatever. They sit like a top hat on the top of each kidney, which the term renal always refers to kidneys. So adrenal refers to the fact that they're on top of them. Pretty small, about 5 centimeters in length, which is right around 2 inches, weigh about 5 grams each. It's not much at all. And like the pituitary, they're broken down into kind of 2 major parts and anatomically, physiologically very different. And the outer portion of the gland is called the adrenal cortex. The inner portion of the gland is called the adrenal medulla. Okay? And surrounding the entire organ is a capsule, which is what we're showing here in this very thin shell on the outside of our picture, which is, I guess, A with a little number 1 symbol. So if you're coloring, just this very thin outer shell would be the capsule, yeah, which just deep to it, we see 3 layers. These 3 layers all have a special name, and they collectively form what we call the adrenal cortex. Okay. Here's a dissectioned and zoomed in microscope slide showing you the 3 sections of the adrenal cortex, the glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. So are superficial to this big area in the middle, which is represented with letter E, the adrenal medulla. I'll talk about the adrenal medulla here in a minute, but let's first talk about the 3 layers of the cortex. Okay. Letter B in our picture is the reticularis, the glomerulosa, okay, this thin layer just deep to the cortex, okay. Letter C is the fasciculata, and then letter D is the reticularis. Each of those regions secretes a different set of hormones. The hormones released by the glomerulosa, collectively called the mineralocorticoids, okay, and the principal and only one that you have to worry about, mineralocorticoid, is called aldosterone. Okay, it is a hormone that helps maintain sodium and potassium homeostasis in your blood. In fact, it's called the salt retaining hormone because it makes us pee out less salt. And also in doing so, if we retain salt, we retain water, which helps us adjust blood volume, blood pressure, and it even plays a role in maintaining blood pH. The hormones of the fasciculata collectively are known as glucocorticoids because they regulate glucose homeostasis, and that includes the hormone cortisol, the only one that you're going to have to worry about. Nicknamed the stress hormone because we release it in response to stress, and it does things to help us combat stress. And in order to combat stress, we need energy, which means that we're going to have to break things down like proteins into amino acids, convert those to glucose, which we can then use to make ATP, make ATP out of fat, so we break down fats. We maintain vascular tone. Unfortunately, this hormone, if we have accelerated or elevated levels of it for a period of time, like, I always tell students, explains why you get sick around finals week when everything is kind of coming to a head and you've got a lot of stuff going on and you're stressed. You have lots of cortisol in your body and you're more susceptible to getting sick because it depresses your immune system. The final set of hormones, we just are going to leave it as they're called androgens or sex steroids, released by the reticularis. Really only play a role in females because men, we produce a more important androgen, which is called testosterone. Okay. So those are the hormones of the adrenal cortex. The medulla is a lot like the posterior pituitary, and that it's really kind of an extension of the nervous system. It's made up of neurosecretory tissue that is tissue composed of neurons adapted to secrete their products, in this case hormones, into the blood. And these hormones, what we call epi and norepi, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, as some people might know them as, are going to be released whenever we have that sympathetic nervous system activated. Remember, that's the fight or flight division of the nervous system, and that triggers the release of these hormones from what we call chromaffin cells into the bloodstream to do things like elevate your heart rate, your blood pressure, increase breathing rate, dilate your windpipe, constrict blood vessels to your kidneys, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, we talked about that quite a bit, so I'll kind of just leave it there. All right, let's move on to our next organ. Now, this is our first true organ that is not strictly endocrine in nature, and by that I mean it's one of those kind of secondary organs. Primary function of the pancreas, in fact, 99% of the cells of the pancreas, what we call center cells, release a chemical called pancreatic juice. Okay, pancreatic juice, which is a chemical that, it's actually really many chemicals, lots and lots of enzymes and other substances that are released into our small intestine to aid in digestion. The other 1% of the cells are the ones that are going to release these hormones. Okay. Before I talk about that, I just want to talk about the pancreas as a whole. Located in the curvature of the duodenum, which is the very first segment of our small intestine. The stomach will be sitting kind of right in here, and it actually covers up a good portion of the pancreas. I told you earlier, the pancreas is a retroperitoneal organ, so it's far back in our abdomen. The head of the pancreas joins the second portion of the duodenum, and the tail meets the spleen. Okay. Tail is going to point over here to the left side of our abdomen, over by the spleen. Body's in the middle, and then the head is kind of nestled in here. I always think of them like they're spooning one another, the pancreas and the duodenum, that is. Okay, I already mentioned the 99% cells, center cells. We'll talk about this. The pancreatic islets are islets of Langerhans cells, which are 4 cells that secrete a different hormone. The first, what we call alpha cells, secrete a hormone called glucagon. I always tell students to remember this little phrase or this little saying. Think glucagon like glucose is gone, because that's when we release it, what we call hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. Okay? You can change out, instead of saying blood sugar, blood glucose, because that's the same thing. And so like if you haven't eaten in several hours, or like when you wake up in the morning, you're probably going to be releasing glucagon to help keep your blood sugar elevated enough that you can sustain normal activities. Okay, so it's going to do things like convert a stored form of carbohydrate, what we call glycogen, to glucose. Process called glycogenolysis. We can actually convert amino acids into glucose, a process we call gluconeogenesis. Okay, after we eat, or whenever we drink something like Dr. Pepper, which is full of sugar, our blood sugar levels will go up, and that will trigger us to release insulin from our beta cells. It's going to do the opposite of glucagon. It's released when we're hyperglycemic, excuse me. It's going to help form glycogen from glucose, a process called glycogenesis. And it's going to help us make or synthesize lipids, a process we call lipogenesis. The third cells are called delta cells, secrete the hormone somatostatin, which inhibits the secretion of insulin and glucagon, slows the absorption of nutrients from the GI tract. And then F cells secrete a hormone called pancreatic polypeptide, which inhibits the action of somatostatin, gallbladder contraction, and the secretion of pancreatic digestive enzymes. Those pancreatic digestive enzymes, the pancreas we'll talk about in much greater detail here in a few weeks when we talk about the digestive system, when we learn about those exocrine cells that you can see here are shown in our 2 pictures at the bottom. So we'll have that to look forward to. All right, our last slide here, I'm just going to throw in, or I just threw in the remaining organs that I wanted to talk about. Instead of just breaking it up into several slides, I just threw them all together here. So we'll start with the gonads, organs that are predominantly built for reproductive function. And they're called gonads because they produce what we call gametes, which is a fancy word to describe sex cells, sperm in men and egg in women. But they also play a role in the reproductive or in endocrine system because of the hormones that they produce. Okay, these are the ovaries in females and the testes in men. Let's talk about the hormones of the ovaries of females. Now, this first hormone has a S at the end, and that's meant on purpose because women do not produce just one estrogen; they produce multiple. But how do I say this? I'll just actually, you know what, I won't even say it. Overall, what they do involves in maturation of an ovum, which is a mature egg, preparation of the uterus for the possibility of a fertilized egg arriving there, because the uterus becomes the womb where the baby grows and develops. Estrogens are also responsible for developing secondary sex characteristics in females, like growth of the breasts, pubic hair, all the things that females develop and start, becoming a woman when they hit puberty, and then the closure of epiphyseal plate, which makes them stop growing in height. Progesterone promotes glycogen storage and growth of blood vessels in the endometrium, which is the inner lining of the uterus. Every month when a female is not pregnant, she undergoes menstruation where she sheds a layer of the endometrium, and after that occurs, they have to replace it, and progesterone helps with that. Progesterone also helps with growing secretory cells and mammary glands. Inhibin, exactly what it sounds like. In fact, men produce it and does the exact same thing. It inhibits the secretion of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, by the anterior pituitary. And then relaxin does exactly what it sounds like, produced when a female is pregnant to increase flexibility of pubic symphysis. It's that little piece of cartilage between the two hip bones, so that the hip bones are kind of able to kind of open up a little bit more. That way, baby can slide through the birth canal a little bit easier. And also it helps with dilating the cervix during labor. Okay, men, we produce in our testes testosterone and inhibin. Like I said, inhibin does the exact same thing in men and women. Testosterone regulates sperm production. It also maintains male secondary sex characteristics, makes us really hairy, growth of hair on the face, armpits, groin, etc., etc. Also promotes things like bigger muscles and bones. Speaking of bones, it helps close the epiphyseal plate, stop us from growing in height. So those are gonads. We'll talk about those more in a future lecture. Actually, it's the very last lecture when we get into the reproductive systems. All right, next gland, pineal gland, small endocrine gland up at the middle part of the brain. You can see it's right here in our illustration. There's the thalamus right there behind it, kind of a little bit below, is that pineal gland. Not a brand new organ to us. We learned previously that it's the major part of the epithalamus. It's made up of masses, neuroglia, and what we call pinealocytes, or secretory cells that secrete that hormone melatonin. That's what sets our circadian rhythms, or the fancy way to describe our biological clock. Things like our sleep-wake cycle, one of the most important components of our circadian rhythms, are regulated by this chemical. We produce more of it during darkness than light, which is why it's thought to promote sleepiness. As illustrated here with the picture showing a sunny sky inhibiting, whereas night exciting the release of those, or that hormone. And then the thymus, our last organ to talk about, bilobed organ, sits on top of our heart in between the lungs. Its function is predominantly centered around immunity. It secretes a lot of different hormones. I'm not even going to worry about you knowing the specific names of them. You can just call them thymus hormones. All of them are involved with the maturation of what we call T cells. Now, in our actual next lecture, we'll learn what T cells are. They're a type of white blood cell that provide us with immunity. And so the hormones that are released from the thymus actually help with immunity. So everything about the thymus is involving immunity. It's actually kind of cool. In fact, one of the neatest things I think about us is that in infants and children, it's rather large, but by old age, it shrinks and basically becomes replaced with adipose and fibrous connective tissues. I wish we could still meet and do dissections and that kind of stuff. All the models that I have don't actually even include the thymus because they're all adults. And that's because the thymus just shrinks up to the point where it's pretty negligible by the time we reach adulthood. So, okay, that's the lecture. And that wraps up unit number 5. Very short unit, but that's okay. I'll see you guys later.